Hi. Wow, it's so good to see you guys. Welcome, welcome. What a fabulous turnout for KRISTIN HANNAH. It's just terrific to have you here. I'm Robin Eidsmoe. I'm the executive director of the conference, and I'm going to be able to welcome you all a little more formally right before the Paul Muldoon talk, but I was delighted that they asked me to come out and introduce this conversation between Jenny and KRISTIN. KRISTIN HANNAH, yes, is an author of more than 24 books. She has a deeply devoted following of readers who catapult her quite often to the top of the bestseller lists across the country. And yes. And this is because she has a wonderful talent for creating plot-driven narratives with very memorable heroines. That is no small task, which any writer here would tell you. Today she will tell the story of how she came to imagine and admire the courageous and unsung combat nurses who served in the Vietnam War and then proceeded to come home to such a disheartening reception in their own country. The Women, her novel, has pathos, heartbreak, and illumination. KRISTIN will be in conversation with Jenny Emery Davidson, who is the pioneering and passionate executive director of the community library in Ketchum. We just couldn't imagine a better pairing than the two of them to be in conversation. So one final note, KRISTIN will be signing books in the book signing tent after this conversation. So please welcome these two outstanding women to the Sun Valley stage. Thank you for being here.
Hi, guys.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome, KRISTIN HANNAH.
Hi, guys. This is so great. Thank you.
As Robin indicated, I mean, you are a prolific writer, but I would argue that your readers are even more voracious. Just down the road from here at the library where I work, we have those nearly 24 books. We have multiple copies of those books. But right now, if you go to the H section in fiction, I think you'll find 2. They are just all checked out all of the time. And The Women, which was published just in February, has already circulated just at our little library in Ketchum 240 times.
Wow. Thank you.
There haven't even been 240 days since the book came out. I think we've got like 25 copies or something. So KRISTIN, thank you for writing stories that inspire and draw people into them. I told her I think maybe half of our door count is attributable to KRISTIN HANNAH novels. So thank you.
Well, thank you, guys. Thank you. I mean, you reading them is what it's all about. So I really appreciate that. And I appreciate you showing up here and inviting me. I've never been to Sun Valley before, and I am in love, and I'm definitely coming back. So beautiful.
So we're here in the opening session of the opening day of the literary extravaganza that is the Sun Valley Writers Conference. And this year's theme is origin stories. So I've been pondering the question of where do stories originate? You've written more than 24 novels, and they've covered a lot of geography. They've covered big time spans and various historical and dramatic situations. So I really want to know, what is the magic room like where all of this creation happens? Can you tell us something about your actual writing space? And does it does it change for the different novels? Like, I'm wondering if you've gone from Dorothea Lange photographs to, photographs from Vietnam. What's your writing space like, and how does it inform your work?
So wait, are you asking about the actual location, the physical location where I write?
Right, yeah.
I write everywhere. I have 3 offices in my home. I use none of them. They just collect my to-be-read pile, which is so big. I write longhand on yellow legal pads. And so I read and write in beach chairs on the beach, when the kids are out skiing, on my back deck, wherever I want to. So it's really all, it's all in my head. And as far as the space, your question also kind of leans a little bit into research. So what research do I do? And for the novels of the last 15 years, probably from Winter Garden on, the historical novels, I do about a year of research. And that's when I'm just reading, and taking notes and taking pictures. And yes, Dorothea Lange, I lived with her for like a year, and Vietnam, and all of these, images and thoughts and information. And then I take all of that and I begin to form a narrative that I think best represents and recreates what it is I have to say. And what it is I have to say usually is that we women have been forgotten and overlooked, and it's about time that someone tells our stories. And so that's what I've been looking for, are women's lost stories. And this particular one, the women, I've wanted to write for 25 years. I first pitched it to my editor in, 1996, I think. And my editor, who had been at Berkeley in 1968, said, "Oh, honey, you're not ready. And nobody wants to read about the Vietnam era either. So come back when you are." And so it's been all these years of me waiting to write this story, and I have to say it feels remarkably like I wasn't the only one waiting to read this story. So,
what made you ready now?
Well, like I said, this current incarnation of my career is about women's lost story and historical novels. And so I always knew that this would be a historical novel, although I push back on the idea that my own life is a historical novel. But that's what they say. So I knew it would be historical, but I didn't know exactly what I had to say about the era. And then COVID hit. And so I live in a small town in Washington on an island, and we were seriously locked down. No restaurants, there's nowhere to go, there's nothing to do. And I was watching, of course, how divided our country was, and it felt like the Vietnam era again. And so that was, I think, step one. And then again, watching the news, I was seeing our nurses and our doctors who were on the front lines of this pandemic, and the difficulties they were facing, and my sense that sometimes they weren't getting the support that they needed. And that's when it all just came together, and I went, oh, I'm going to write about the nurses who served in Vietnam.
I love thinking about that decades-long gestation period, and then the kind of catalyst of this shared crisis of the pandemic that propelled this novel forward.
Yeah, I think it was just kind of a lucky moment in time, and I've been able to connect, of course, in doing the research with some remarkable Vietnam nurse vets, and hearing their story and their children's stories has been, it's probably been the most vital and important moment of my career. I feel like I've been spending all these 25 years in a way so I could write this book. Now I just have to figure out what's next, which is horrible.
It's the texture of your details in The Women and in your previous novels that makes them so absorbing to read. And the quantity, the depth of the research that must inform that is really astonishing. And I'm wondering if, as you're doing your research, there are certain kinds of historical details that you're looking for, or that when you find them, you're like, that's what's going to make this real. Because it's not just getting the location right in Vietnam, it's the shoes that someone is wearing. So what details really resonate with you, and how and where do you find them?
I mean, that's really true. I think that's what takes a book from a historical novel to a novel that you feel that you are a part of, that you could live in. And that is, I think, a specific detail question. And I think for me personally, it goes back to my geek girl days, you know, my fantasy era when I was young, and loving, you know, The Lord of the Rings and, you know, all of those kinds of books, and loving world building. And so, you know, I think, that level of specificity to create a world that did in fact exist, but we haven't quite experienced it the way, you know, I want you to. And there's always details in the reading. I'll never forget when I was writing The Four Winds a few years ago, which was about the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. And I was reading somebody's memoirs, and they were talking about the storms in the Dust Bowl, and when they hit, that all of the centipedes came crawling out of the walls. And I thought, oh man, I got to put that in. I mean, that's the most horrific thing I can imagine. And so I'm looking for things like that, little moments that transport you, that really make a world come alive.
I think of the Ski Vietnam t-shirt.
Yeah.
I think of the black overnight bag, belts, headbands, shoes, and the language. I'm wondering what it was like for you to immerse yourself in military language, which I hesitate to even quote because I'm not sure I'll say it correctly, like Mascal and FNGs, which I'm not sure if that's really military or not, but, and, you know, even the cursing. How did you learn that language?
Well, that's the job, honestly. You know, I wrote a book several years ago called Homefront about a female Black Hawk pilot who deployed. And I called her up out of the blue and, you know, said, I'm writing this novel, and would you please speak to me and help me and stuff. She's like, sure, come on down. So I went down to Joint Base McCord and sat down. And I had done like 6 months of research at this point. And I sat down and she started talking. Oh, and everything was the BBD and the da-da-da and the blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, what are you saying to me? I understood nothing of what she said. And she said, oh, I understand. Okay, let's go back. and kind of gave me the basics. And I was always, then and with the women, very nervous about getting those kinds of details right, because it's so important. And it's not my world. And in fact, in this book, one of the things that was interesting was when I wrote the first draft, the Vietnam section, the war section, took place in 2 hospitals. And I created fake names for those hospitals because I was afraid in writing it that the latrines would be in a different place, or that the commissary would be in a different place, or I would have the OR wrong or something. And when I gave the novel to my vets to read, their overwhelming comment was, you have to use the real names. And I said, but what if I've made a mistake? And they said, oh, they moved around all the time. And they said, and frankly, if you did, we'd rather have a mistake at the real place than a fake place. And that's the first time I've ever run into that. So that was kind of interesting. Frightening, but interesting.
You know, that's interesting to me, too, that they insisted on use the real names, given what becomes a refrain throughout the novel, I was there. And there's also a point in the novel, this is early on, although if you haven't read it yet, my goodness, read the women. Early on, Frankie's in the field hospital tent, and she's facing yet another soldier with catastrophic injuries, and she's working with a rookie surgeon, and the rookie surgeon freezes up. And she looks across this wounded soldier and says to the surgeon, "See him. See Specialist Glenn Short."
Well, that, I mean, that's the whole arc of this book for Frankie in particular, going back to Unforgettable Heroines. I mean, I think the reason that Frankie is so relatable and so interesting is she begins this novel so completely unprepared for this experience that, she has chosen. And that particular moment, it shows the arc of Frankie over this time period, because she begins, on day one thinking, I have no business being here. She had about 3 weeks of nursing training, and, they send her off to Vietnam, and she's in, a hospital with all these critical injuries, and she doesn't know how to start an IV, basically. And to the point where she's then, a year later, a doctor comes in, and he's that overwhelmed again. And so now it's on her to say, let me help you. This is how you do it, one person at a time, And so I ended this novel so incredibly in awe of nurses in general. And, the job that they do, and the compassion they bring to it, and the toll that they pay for these kinds of situations.
And you make that trajectory for Frankie so vivid, in part because of how we first meet her. And there's 2 scenes early on that make that moment where she's saying, "See Specialist Glenn Short," all the more dramatic. And that's the opening paragraphs, where we first meet her. And it's a practically languid evening with champagne glasses tinkling and candles. We're on Coronado Island, and it's a lovely farewell party for her brother. And then there's the time when she's going to Vietnam. She's on the plane, and what she's going through in her mind is kind of, I'm built for this. Like, there's rules, I can follow rules, everything. I've got my manual, I've read it. And there's the buzzing of the engines and the talking of the soldiers. And this is one detail that stuck with me for some reason: the snap hiss of pop cans opening. I mean, just mundane details, and she feels like it's under control. And it is never going to be like that again.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if you could talk about when and how you decided to introduce Frankie, because it could have started with her in the field tent. It didn't have to start at Coronado Island. We didn't have to see that build up to her getting there. How did you arrive at the starting point, and how to introduce Frankie?
So I chose where I chose because I tried everything else, and they didn't work as well. And so I wrote a draft of the book where we started with Frankie at 13 and showed her whole life. And, and I just keep paring away until I get to exactly what it is I need. And I never know exactly what I need until I get there, which is a really disturbing proposition, frankly. And so I just keep, sort of going back and learning her and layering her life. And the point is really that I want to create someone who is very like the women who went there, and show the arc that is very like what so many of them dealt with. And, you got to remember, at this time period, we're talking about women who came of age in the late 50s, early 60s, which was a very different time. And a lot of the memoirs that I read, which are listed in the back of the book, and I can't recommend them highly enough, these women were just young, eager, patriotic, and volunteered, to go to war. And, you see in the book, one of the interesting things is they have a party for her brother who goes off to war. They're all very excited. And then, Frankie goes off, and her parents are horrified. What are you doing? You've got no business being over there. And that sort of starts the whole arc of her journey of sort of coming into her own and finding her voice and being the woman that she chooses to be, not the woman that she was raised to be.
The novel, like Frankie's life, has two distinct sections. There's the Vietnam section, and then there's the after Vietnam, back in the U.S. section. And I'm wondering, did you write them in that order? How did one inform the other? When you were writing Vietnam, were you already imagining what comes after? Would you go back and reread Vietnam as you were going through what was happening in that after world? And was one section harder to write than the other because they're traumatic in very different ways?
Yeah, Ridley's over here laughing because he knows I've got the worst process in the world for all of this. I imagined a very different book originally. And so I wrote that book, and that was really a love story. It was, and that's why I said it started when she was young, and it was a love story, and it was a love story with a man that that went to Vietnam with her. And it just, the problem was the Vietnam section of this novel, from scene one, day one, stayed almost exactly the same. I always knew what Vietnam was like and what it looked like and what I had to say. I had less clarity on what came after. And in fact, I did a lot of pushing back on what ended up becoming the second half of the story, which is, you know, the vets coming home to being poorly treated, to and the women especially being invisible, and the struggles that a lot of them faced with their undiagnosed PTSD, and especially women who were told, even by the VA, you know, how could you have any kind of emotional trauma, you weren't in combat, and, you know, all of those sorts of things. I really pushed back on that because I felt like I had written that before, and that it was so dark, and, you know, and I just loved Frankie by this time, and I just wanted to prop her up and say, you go, girl, this was great. But ultimately, it just didn't feel real. And so that's when I ended up realizing that with as powerful as the Vietnam section of this novel was, the second half had to be as powerful or more. And when you're going, you know, when the first half and the power comes from combat, it's really hard to keep that level for another, you know, 300 pages. So I hope I answered that. I'm not sure.
Oh, I love
I'm
that.
rambling.
I mean, to think of the power came from combat and the viscerality of that in the first section, and it's a lot of interior tumult that is also violent in the aftermath.
You put life or death on the table, the book writes itself. That's why, you know, World War II books are so powerful. It's why war novels are so powerful. You're like, oh, I may die today. Okay. But then you have the whole rest of your life. And that has to feel to the reader as important. And the stakes have to be just as high to sort of to heal her, I guess.
Mm-hmm. I just have to write that down. The stakes have to be just as high to heal her. You know, I'm thinking now of the epigraph at the beginning. So before we meet Frankie, we meet Frank Church. And of course, we're in Frank Church country here in Idaho. You open the novel with an epigraph. Frank Church was a U.S. Senator from Idaho from 1957 to 1981. We're just south of the wilderness area that bears his name as we sit here now. And I think this epigraph propels the novel in an interesting direction for the big story that follows, in a way that speaks to what you were just describing, of the drama going beyond the violence of the scene of the war. And the epigraph is this: this war has stretched the generation gap so wide that it threatens to pull the country apart. How did you arrive at that epigraph, and why use it to open the novel?
Well, we got to remember too, I was writing this novel, you know, during COVID, and it just so perfectly encapsulated this particular era, because it was very much young versus old, and the divide was very real and very strong, and it just seemed like a perfect setup for it.
And it sets another dramatic line for the novel that might not be what we expect, because we're going into war. We know there's going to be drama there. But I think one of the most taught relationships in the novel is between Frankie and her father. So speaking to that generation gap, I mean, there are love stories in this novel, but I think the man arguably who wreaks the most havoc on her heart is her father. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, it was really important to me because, in reading these memoirs about the nurses who went, almost all of them came from the greatest generation families who had grown up on patriotic stories of their family's service in World War II. And that was very deeply ingrained. And so that created this juxtaposition, because here his daughter is going off to war. And I very clearly made her father not a war veteran, because I wanted him to really think that he knew what war was, but he didn't. And it's Frankie who knows what war is when she comes home, and essentially has to teach her father what he's been wrong about in a lot of ways. And I think for me, one of the most powerful moments in the book is when her father understands the mistake that, oh my gosh, hi, Cindy. Anyway, I can't see anything. I'm just saying, but yeah. So
that's not what the father says.
That's not what the father says. Sorry. That was one of the most important moments to me that the whole book was working towards, was trying to get her family healed again. And she comes to a moment in this book at some point, I can't remember where it is, but in the second half, where she accepts that her parents may never understand, may never be proud of her, may never ask her questions about Vietnam, may prefer to pretend that those couple of years never happened. And she's okay with that, because she understands that families have rough edges, and that people have, dark corners. And sometimes we just have to accept people for as who they are, and sort of move on and heal ourselves.
And her whole notion of healing and what that can look like, I think, really evolves over the course of the novel. And of course, Barb and Ethel are her family throughout much of this, and it's a different kind of family. I see friendship between women as really a driving consideration throughout your work. And I wonder if you were surprised in any way how those female friendships took shape in this particular novel.
Yeah, it's interesting. So really, for all of the many things this book is about, female friendship is the beating heart of it. That is what this book is about. And it's interesting because I didn't see that for a very long time. I thought it was about other things. I thought it was a love story. I thought it was a war story. I thought it was a woman's journey. And really, in the writing process, I was writing Frankie, and this whole book is in her viewpoint, which means I'm very narrowed as an author. I can only know what she knows. I can only write about what she sees and experiences. And I tend to create characters as I need them. And so I remember I'm riding along, and, she's on the plane that you've talked about. She's been dropped in Vietnam. She is completely unprepared. She has no business being here. They move her from place to place, and they finally put her in what's called a hooch, which is her little cabin quarters at the hospital, and drop her off. And I'm describing the hooch per research as 3 little corners, with a woman in each one. And I go, I'll need 2 women. Okay. I wonder who these two women are. And
and who are they?
So, you know, I sort of put them in based on research. And in the evolution of this novel, as it went from, you know, the love story to what it was, these two women just kept coming forward and kept forming and became essentially soulmates. And it's kind of like my novel Firefly Lane, where I show you that female friendship can be as deep, as powerful, as important as a soulmate. And I think that's what these three women are. And I loved writing the scenes, you know, where they showed up for each other, because I think that's what girlfriends do.
They're irrepressible, and it changes the dynamic both before and after Vietnam. There's one small detail that serves as an anchor for me in the story, and it's a small gray stone. I'm wondering if you could tell the story of that gray stone that Frankie first receives as a gift from a young Vietnamese boy when she is out in the field, and then it's going to get passed along throughout the novel. What's the story behind that small gray stone?
So many of the doctors and nurses who were serving over there went on humanitarian missions to help the locals, you know, giving shots and, you know, doing all kinds of stuff. And it was important for me to show a couple of those scenes. And in one of them, Frankie and her team is in a village, and they're helping out a small boy. And he gives her the only thing he really has of value, which is just a little stone. And she puts it in her pocket, and it becomes kind of a talisman that she keeps and then passes on to someone else in need. So, you know, again, so much of my writing, honestly, I think comes back to my love of fantasy and, you know, my love of high drama. And no one would ever think that, but it really is true. I love the big moments. I love the high stakes, but I also love the small moments that mean something. So.
And I think that stone, it gives us a moment of pause. And I think of what makes it a talisman, what endows it with magical powers, is the fact that it is a gift and it is solid. And she is in this environment where, like, even, I mean, the human body is not solid. We see it being torn apart.
Yes.
And that little stone becomes a weight that can anchor her, and then she is able to gift it to others, and it's going to keep resurfacing. Do you have a talisman?
Does wine count? Because that's... no. I don't know. I mean, I'm not much of a collector or, you know, that kind of stuff. No. But books. I have books everywhere. So I guess I wrote once that books were the mile markers of one of my characters' lives. And that's what it is for me. I look back on every era by what I was reading. And like when my son started coming of age, I couldn't wait to pass along the books that meant something to me. Like, is he ready for Lord of the Rings yet? Is he ready for Dune? You know, and now my granddaughter, I'm gauging her and passing along the books that I love to her. So I guess books.
Books are the best talismans.
Yes, I guess so.
In a few minutes, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. I want to ask you about the title. You know, the title is simple. It is unadorned. It does not specify a time or place. It is plural. How did you come to the title?
So there are two things I am particularly bad at in this job that I have. One of them is picking what I'm going to write. I have a very hard time wrangling an idea. I can't pick a refrigerator, so you can imagine like what it takes me to decide to spend 3 years on. And the other one is titling. I'm terrible. And so for this book, I can't remember what it was originally called, but I know that I loved the title and nobody else did. And the fact that I can't now remember it is perhaps a sign that, that they were right. And so we went back and forth, my editor and my agent and I, trying to title this. And, you know, we'd text each other or email each other. And finally, I sort of threw up my hands and I said, how about the women? And everyone said, well, that's a terrible title. What women? Where? And I thought, well, that's true, right? So it seems too generic. And so we kept trying and trying and trying. And every couple of weeks, I'd say, how about the women? And my editor would say, no, that's no good. And then I got a text from her one day, and she said, I was just out, I had a thought, what if we did? And she came up with the sort of tagline on the back, the missing, the forgotten, the brave, the women. And I went, those are my women. And then I said, and then we put a helicopter on the cover. And that was it. And then I sent it to my fabulous Vietnam nurse, Diane Carlson Evans, who I consulted with and who helped me in this. She wrote a great book called Healing Wounds, which I highly recommend. I said, okay, I think we're going to call it The Women. And she said, well, that's a terrible title. What women? And so then she writes me this long note, and at the end it says, Diane Carlson, one of the women. And I wrote back and I said, Diane, you just identified as one of the women. She goes, oh, yeah. Okay, it's a good title. So there you go.
You said at one point there was a concern, it seems too generic. But to me, that speaks to the thrust of the whole novel, that these women are aching, really, to go from being anonymous, generic, to identified.
I certainly believe that. And interestingly enough, which I never expected, I do occasionally hear pushback from people that their argument with it is that this is about one woman. So why did I call it The Women? And I maintain that it's about all the women. It just is one woman's story, but it's about all of them. So
I think it's about Frankie's mother, too.
It is.
You know, the letters that go back and forth, and her evolution. I think it's Frankie becomes a vehicle for multiple women's stories.
I think so, yeah.
Can we take some questions from the audience? I see a hand up right here. The microphone is coming to you.
Thank you. So first off, I'm a little bit nervous because I'm a total girl fan. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Let me come out here. Sorry, I don't want to be in the way. So this is a question more about some of my favorite authors. You're my number one. My number two is Isabel Allende and her magical realism. If you haven't read the book, House of Spirits, please do. It's amazing. Yes. So my question for you is, some of your novels, like The Four Winds and The Nightingale, are firmly grounded in historical reality, while others, such as Magic Hour, incorporate elements that could be seen as magical realism. How do you balance historical accuracy with more fantastical elements in your storytelling, and how does this affect your approach to character development and plan construction?
What was that last sentence?
In plan construction. So your character development and plan construction. A mighty
what
question.
What a fantastic question.
Wow, yeah.
Okay, there you go.
Well, I can say that when I do books that are, I guess, a little bit more leaning into sort of supernatural or unusual or those kinds of things, I tend to anchor them in fact as much as possible. You know, Allende has that beautiful language and a different sensibility. I have tried to do that. I can't do it. I'm not very good at it. The only time I really think I approached it was in Winter Garden. If you read that, I wrote a fairy tale, and that was really fun. I really enjoyed, sort of going off into the fantasy or, you know, that kind of an element. But the whole thing was an allegory for something that was actually happening that was very dark. So I guess I'm a lot more in fact than I am sort of in the magical realm. I feel that's my next career. As soon as I figure out how to do that, I will. I'll write some huge fantasy epic. But okay. Anybody else?
And I see a question, I think, over here.
You can see somebody?
Yes, she's taking the mic to her.
Oh, okay.
Hi there, thank you so much.
Hi.
Can you tell us about your path to writing your first novel, what that was like for you, and kind of how you went through that entire transition from your career onto being an author?
Sure, my origin story. Makes me sound like a superhero, I love it. So I was a lawyer, and when I was in my third year of law school, my mother was in the hospital losing her battle with breast cancer. And so I was, I don't know, 23, 24, 25, whatever it was at that time. And I remember going to the hospital, and I was complaining about some issue in my life. And she said, you know, don't worry about law school. You're going to be a writer anyway. And I remember thinking, what? And my dad's in the background going, we just got her into law school. Are you kidding? And so my mom and I sort of started talking, and she said we should write a book together. And being mother and daughter, we immediately started arguing about what kind of book we were going to write. And I wanted to write horror or fantasy, and she wanted to write historical romance. And, you know, so we argued, and she said, look, I'm sick, I pick, we're writing historical romance. And so I said, okay. And so every day after class, I would go to the library, stand in the stacks, and bring, you know, research home. And so we sat there for the last months of her life designing this book, which we thought was genius. I had never bothered to actually read a historical romance at this point, so I thought it was genius. Anyway, and so we just had this wonderful time, and unfortunately, I actually wrote the first scene the day she passed away. And so she didn't ever get to read it, but I did get to, you know, whisper. I started our book. And then after she passed away, I just threw it all in a box and put it in my closet and went on with life, finished law school, passed the bar, started practicing. And then a few years later, I got pregnant with my son, and I had a difficult pregnancy. So I went into labor at 14 weeks, and I was bedridden for the rest of the pregnancy. So this was 1988. There was, you know, we had 3 TV stations. All of my girlfriends were working. My husband was working. So there was literally nothing to do except watch The Price is Right. And Erica Kane was pregnant, and she was bedridden at the same time. And she was like not having the same pregnancy that I was having. And so my husband stepped in one day, and he said, what about that book you and Sharon were going to write? And so I thought, I got like 6 months. How hard can it be? And that was really the beginning. And so I started writing. And then once I had my son, I wanted to be an at-home mom. And so I gave myself 5 years to learn how to write. And I sold my first book when he was 2. And I've been doing this ever since. So, yeah. It's a good job.
I see the microphone going over here.
Thank you. I want to thank you very much for all of your books. I have probably read all of them, but this book touched me in such a way because my brother was one of the college students called up by the ROTC when he was in college and he went to Vietnam. And he never said anything when he went there. When he came home, oh, it was nothing. I never saw anything. I sat in the office and I didn't do anything but office work. Well, I know from your book, you couldn't avoid seeing things. And that helped me understand my brother and the trials that he has had since that time. And I thank you very, very much for giving me that.
Thank you. That is so meaningful. I mean, I'm hearing from so many people who are finally talking to their brothers, their fathers, their grandfathers, and hearing stories that have been, kept in the dark for a long time. So thank you. That means a lot.
I see a couple of hands. Oh, the microphone is over here. We'll jump over to this side.
Yes. Hi. Could you talk for a minute about the Nightingale? I love your books, but I loved the Nightingale a lot, just the background of how you came to write that.
What did he say, the Nightingale?
The Nightingale and the background of how you came to write that.
So I was a book I referenced earlier called Winter Garden about World War II Russia. I was writing that book, and it was sort of my first foray after many years, first foray period into historical fiction, and it was half contemporary and half historical. And in doing the research for that book, I came across the story of a young woman named Andrée Dujong, who was a Belgian woman at 19 years old. And she and her father had started one of the first escape routes out of Nazi-occupied France for downed airmen. And I read her story, and she's walking across the Pyrenees in her espadrilles and taking these guys and saving their lives. And she ended up in a concentration camp. And I was just so angry that as a well-read woman, I didn't know this story. I had read and seen so much about World War II, but I didn't know this particular story. And so I remember thinking, this is a great story. I can't wait till someone writes it. That would be great. But I'm not going to do it. I'm not taking on World War II, And so in the couple of years that followed, I still had no interest in writing it, but I was reading about the women of World War II and the French women, the women of the resistance. And so finally, after about 2 years, I just thought, maybe it's my story. Maybe I just have to jump off the ledge. It was very intimidating to suddenly say, okay, I'm going to be a historical novelist now. And to sort of take that risk. And then it was France, and, I had never been to France really. And so it was a big undertaking. And, but I realized nobody else was going to do it. And so I just jumped in. And at that point, I had a contract to write a book a year. And I did the 1 year, coming up on the 1 year with the Nightingale. I called my editor and I said, this has the potential to really be quite a book, but I can't make it quite a book in 1 year. Do you mind if I take another year? And they don't really like that sentence a lot, but I was very lucky. They said yes, and allowed me to sort of, I guess, spread my wings and learn how to do something new. And I will say, and this is not just about writers, this is about all of us all the time. It is never too late to just reinvent yourself, to just choose to be something else or someone else, or try something that has scared you for your whole life. So just do it.
The microphone over, here, and then we'll go back to that side.
Okay.
Hi, thank you so much. I feel like I'm a little bit of a before and after, before KRISTIN, and then after, because I didn't know anything about you probably 2 months ago, and I am so thrilled to learn all of the anecdotal information. And I've only read 2 of your books, The Women, and then I went to The Four Winds, and I love them. But I'm interested in hearing do you have anything to say regarding the relationship of the women and men? Because they were very tortured. Most of the relationships were tortured in those books. They were not easy relationships. Because I haven't read all of them, I don't know if that's a recurring theme or it was coincidental within those two books, but it did pique my interest when I was reading them, and I did see some similarity.
There is nothing easy in my books. I mean, seriously, there is like a before and after where there is a part of my career, and I would say it's before Breaking Bad and after Breaking Bad. Because Breaking Bad was the show, was the moment, Breaking Bad and Game of Thrones, which I was watching at the same time. And I realized you can make it way worse if you want to. and I realized that whole idea of make it worse is what keeps you on the edge of your seat all the time. And so, and that it goes particularly well with my vision and my sort of overarching message, which is women are tough and durable, and ordinary women are surviving extraordinary things all the time and becoming different versions of themselves and finding their voice. And I feel that character in novels, as in life, is revealed by hardship. And so I want to know who you are when the chips are down, and I want you to hit the bottom and then come back up and decide who you want to be. And so that is a theme, you know, you'll see a lot, but there's different versions of it.
Up there, yes.
This is more of a compliment than a question. As a field surgeon during the Vietnam crisis, I think you captured the dedication of these nurses to the nth degree. They gave more of their time and effort than you can imagine to make this thing a better place. And we were totally ill-prepared to manage the issue of PTSD. So we couldn't even handle our own, much less help them through this period. But the fact that you caught the essence of these women so well, I really appreciate that.
Oh, thank you. Wow. Let me just say, like I said, I've referred to Diane Carlson Evans, and there's some others. They're all mentioned in the book. But I was invited after writing this book and after working with Diane to make it as authentic as possible. She is the woman who is the founder of the Vietnam Women's Memorial. And so she invited my husband and me to the 30th anniversary, which was last November in Washington, D.C. And to see, you know, on Veterans Day, to see there was probably 100 of these nurses and donut dollies and, you know, women who had served over there at their memorial, talking about their service, and their kids were there. And it was probably one of the most, I guess, emotional and empowering moments of my life. And to see them come together and hug each other and sort of reconnect was amazing.
Okay, I see.
know.
I know. Where you go?
to pick.
Oh, they're back there.
Oh.
Sorry, that's where the microphone is. Yes.
Oh, okay.
How much of Frankie's character arc was planned, and how much of it came through the writing process?
How much what?
How much of Frankie's character was planned, if I heard that correctly, and how much did it get shaped as you were writing?
Well, there's always a plan. I mean, I always think I know who she is. I know who I need her to be, and then I begin writing. And there's this sort of alchemic process that happens for me in writing. There's a lot of, let me back up. There's a lot of writers who know what they're going to write and then sit down and write that book. I attempt to do that, but as I go forward, I tend to discover a better book than I had originally intended. And that comes from refining and editing and sort of changing. So I always knew that Frankie's arc was going to be from the debutante to the warrior. I mean, I knew that's who she was going to be. And who she became was a little different. But once I picked West Coast Coronado debutante, that's a woman, and I think we know her, you know, and so I start with that stereotype, and then I sort of slowly create her through her relationships to people, I guess. I don't know where the mic is.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap up, and a mic is coming here. Yes.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi.
I'm a huge fan of yours, and I think I've read nearly every book, but it seems to me that there was a big shift in your writing from Nightingale and all of the books after, and you mentioned that you did take an extra year to write that. So have all of your books since then, have you taken more time to write those? And then my second question is, I follow you on Instagram, and I saw that you have written your first sentence of your next book. So does that mean
Did I say that?
So does that mean that we have to wait 3 more years for your next book? And do you have any hints?
Can you tell us the sentence?
No. And let me tell you, the chances that it is the first sentence 3 years from now is nil. Very, very unlikely. There's been a couple of times, I guess, let me think, 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 times, I think, in my career, I have reimagined myself. So I was a historical romance author, and then I wrote a book called On Mystic Lake. I left my publisher, and I took 2.5 years to write that, and came back as now I'm this author. That was 7 years after I started writing. 7 years after that, I left again and wrote a book called Firefly Lane. And that was a 2-year process where I reimagined, you know, who I wanted to be again. Turns out, interestingly enough, that The Nightingale is 7 years from that. And that's when I moved into that one. So I think it may be ADHD. It may be, I don't like feeling comfortable for very long. And I'm well aware that I'm past the 7-year mark. So I don't know what's coming next. Hold on. We'll see.
We have just a couple of minutes left, and I'm wondering if we could circle back, KRISTIN, to you talking about going to the inauguration of the Vietnam Women's Memorial. And I think that's such a significant component of the women. We really have 3 different memorials, I think, throughout it. We have the Heroes Wall, which we are introduced to in the opening pages. Frankie's father has all of these photographs of men in the family who have served, no women. And then we know that the Vietnam War Memorial is going to come, but the actual last word of the novel is not a word, it's a photograph. And it's just a photograph of that. Could you talk about those different memorials and what it means to memorialize? Each of those, I think, defines heroes in a very different way.
Well, I think, you know, who was I speaking to? I think it was somebody on NPR was talking about the last couple of pages of the novel. And the interviewer says, it feels like you're just speaking to us. Like, you know, you're telling us what you think and what it is you have to say in these last couple of pages. And I'm like, that's pretty much what it was, and that's what I was thinking. And it's because by the time I got there, and actually those final pages and the end of the book changed in the weeks after I went to the memorial, because I sort of realized the power of all of this, of meeting these veterans, which I had all really been, I hadn't met any of them before. And I think it really became about me understanding that remembrance and gratitude matters. And, you know, I've written before about vets and PTSD, and I speak, you know, passionately about the importance of taking care of people who have risked so much for us and sacrificed so much for us. So I just wanted the novel to be at the very end, the last moment was, don't forget to remember, because it means so much.
KRISTIN Hannah, thank you for writing books that help us to remember and help us to see.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Oh, gosh. What are you doing here? Thank you, guys. Thank you so much.